Okay, we can get started. Um, Good afternoon, everybody. I'm Jason Ren, and the Acting Director of the Anlinger Center for Energy and the Environment. It's my great pleasure to introduce Anlinger Center's inaugural Distinguished Postdoctoral Fellow webinar series. Our Distinguished Postdoc Fellows program supports outstanding young researchers working to solve pressing energy and environmental problems. Fellows in this program are supported by the center and collaborate with multiple investigators to advance the center's mission of finding practical solutions for sustainable energy and environmental solutions. Consequently, their research integrates approaches across multiple disciplines, from fundamental science to engineering, architecture, social sciences, public policy, and beyond. The result is fascinating breadth of work that we are very proud to be able to present with this seminar series. The fellows have made amazing accomplishments, published research in high-quality journals, and landed with nice jobs in leading universities and other places. Before we begin, I'd like to start by introducing Dr. Charlie Sharpless, the Anlinger Center's Assistant Director for Research. At the center, Charlie's focus is on strategic research development, and one of his roles is administering the Distinguished Postdoc Fellow program. He spearheaded this webinar series in an effort to sustain our research community during these difficult times. And I want to thank him for his excellent work putting this together. Charlie, do you want to say a few words?
No, thank you. I think we can, I will close up at the end and say a few words then, but thanks for that introduction, Jason.
Well, thank you, Charlie. Next, I'd like to introduce Dr. Forrest Maggers, Assistant Professor of Architecture with the joint appointment at the Anlinger Center. First, conducts research in a variety of areas related to building systems design, renewable energy, thermal management, and seasonal energy storage, among other pursuits. For the past 2 years, Forrest has served as a primary mentor for today's speaker, Dr. Kian Wee Chen. Please join me in welcoming Forrest to provide an introduction for Dr. Chen's talk. Forrest.
Okay, thanks, Jason. Sorry, there's a little bit of a hiccup on my end, but it's very much a pleasure to be able to introduce Kian Wee, and thanks very much, Jason, for the introduction and for leading us through these, extraordinary times, and to Charlie for putting this all together. It really is a special thing for me to be able to both host Kian Wee and introduce him, as we were just realizing that we've been working together now for nearly a decade. So Kian Wee is not only a postdoctoral researcher in my chaos lab, but he's also a friend and collaborator across many different projects, and has been a wonderful contributor to the work that we are doing, as Jason described, trying to make buildings more efficient and more effective and provide more healthy and intelligent living environments. Kian Wee originally worked with me during his PhD, which was between the ETH Zurich and the National University of Singapore, where we were working together in Singapore on building systems, where he taught me everything I know about surviving in hot and humid climates, as well as studying how low exergy systems can be integrated into computational frameworks and architecture, which he'll be talking more about those algorithmic assisted design ideas that have evolved since then. And since then, he has also participated in the Singapore MIT Alliance for Research. I see his advisor, Les Norford, is among the participants. Is glad to have him here. And he continued working with National University of Singapore, and has more recently been a visiting scholar with University of Pennsylvania, working on architectural studios. And in our group here at Princeton, he's been helping develop new frameworks for spatial and temporal data management and visualization. So I look very much forward to seeing what Kian Wee has put together for us today. It's a great pleasure working with him. And thanks again to everybody who supports the postdoctoral fellowship program here at the Andlinger Center. And with that, I'll hand it over to you, Kian Wee.
Hi, thanks for the kind words, and thanks everyone for being here to listen to my webinar. So let me just quickly share my screen. So first of all, again, welcome to my webinar. And my title for the webinar is Algorithm Assisted Design, Supporting Integrative Design in the Built Environment. And okay, wait. Seems like there's a freeze on my screen. So the top objective of my today's webinar is to talk about my research, and the top objective of my research is to use the algorithm to support an integrative design process in a multidisciplinary design team. So you can see on the slide, I kind of illustrated very abstract representation of a design process where usually you have the problems and you go through multiple tasks, such as modeling, design formulation, field studies, to come up with solutions and new designs. And you it goes back and forth between problems and solution and the task. And how do you use algorithms here is to essentially identify tasks that can be automated, that is routine. And we develop algorithms to automate those tasks and make it much easier to perform those tasks so that you can arrive at solution faster. And the main goal for that is that, currently, we spend a lot of time actually doing modeling, especially in a more multidisciplinary design team where you have to deal with different models working together, different protocols, hardware, software, interfaces, that you actually spend more time in trying to get this task ready than having more time in reflection and discussion. And the whole idea that you can inject algorithmic work into the process is that a lot of this routine task can actually be automated, what I call algorithm assisted work, and thus you have more time to spend on reflection and discussion between different disciplines, where most of the time we do not have a common ground or common platform to actually understand the problem well. So the use of computation algorithms would help us be able to do have better interpersonal communications and discuss intersections between discipline. So I will use 4 projects today to illustrate my research. So and how algorithms can be used to facilitate a kind of integrative process in study and the design of the built environment. So the first project is where algorithms is used to help acquire more high resolution data to help better model the environment. And the second project is about how we can use that to facilitate physical prototyping and feedback into architectural design. The third project is about how this can be used to facilitate communications between researchers from different disciplines. And finally, the fourth project goes back to kind of my background in how does all these algorithms help in designing better buildings and built environment as a whole. So I will start with the first project, which is called Processing Terrestrial LIDAR Scan Trees for Multidisciplinary Analysis. So these projects are not arranged chronologically, but rather task-wise and events-wise to kind of give me to kind of provide everyone a broad overview of what my research is about. So this is when I was done when I was back in Singapore with some of my colleagues from different disciplines, that works on air pollution, remote sensing, and even landscape architecture. So the objective is to use LiDAR scanners to be able to better acquire high resolution data and information about trees. So you can use that information, for example, to better account for carbon accounting, where trees are essentially seen as a carbon sinks, and how much by being able to have a more precise volume of a tree, you can actually have better understand how much carbon the tree is capturing, and that is very useful for understanding the environment. Or you can use it to run environmental simulation like CFDs on city scale. Or for remote sensing people, they use terrestrial LIDAR scan as a way to calibrate airborne LIDAR scan. So it's very useful to be able to process this data and use it in all these different analysis. But one of the main problem here is that, so this is a typical terrestrial LiDAR scan scene that you get after the scan. So it can go up, the information can go up to be about half a gigabyte to a few gigabytes depending on how you scan it. And you can see it's quite difficult to navigate. It's a lot of information, and they're all essentially stored as points. So each of these are made up of like millions of points with different intensity and color information. And how do you actually make sense of this data and how do you process it is not trivial. So a lot of researchers from different disciplines wants to make use of the data, but it's really difficult for them to assess this data. So this is kind of what was before. Before all these researchers used terrestrial LiDAR scan, they would think of ideas and they would measure it with less resolution sensors, and they will spend a lot of time to figure that out and then arrive at the model. So this project is interesting is that we are introducing a new technique and new software and algorithms to make this process much more streamlined and be able to get the resolution of data that's not possible without this hardware and software integration. And as you can see, so hopefully you have more time to be able to reflect and discuss, and things like scanning, registering, and segmenting the data and reconstruction could be done through computation, so that you do not have to spend so much time in it. So, for example, this is the scene that I have shown just now. And let's say we are just interested in this tree. How do you actually extract that information and use that? So what I did was, what I contributed to this design project was, I came up with a streamlined workflow, and with using existing algorithms, existing software, or open source software, and sometimes developing or implementing my own, and gluing them together into a streamlined workflow so that it's easy for anyone to be able to repeat or acquire this data. But it starts all the way right back to the start, where you have to actually look at the hardware itself. So in order to perform this, to acquire tree data, you need to look at specification of the LiDAR scanner, where it has a certain wavelength, in this case, 1550 nanometers wavelength, so that you can separate the difference, so that you can classify and separate the difference between points that's the leaves of the tree and points that's actually the branches and the trunks of the trees. And you also have to scan from multiple angles to capture a full representation of the trees at the same time. So once you have run the scan, you kind of have to register the different scans together to form a single scene. And then you have to segment and classify it. So as I said, because of the LiDAR scanner used, it's much easier to separate the trees from the branches, because the trees and branches returns different intensity when a laser is shot out and it hits a leaf and it hits a branch. The intensity return of the laser is different, and it makes it much easier to separate the branches and the trees. So once you have separated it, you would apply different existing algorithms to reconstruct the trees. So for example, for running city scale CFDs, wind analysis, it will be useful to represent the trees as voxels, and each voxels having certain attributes. For example, whether this voxel is a leaf voxel or this voxel a branch voxel, and it's yeah, for calculation. And you can also use it to calculate leaf area index, which usually in landscape architecture they use it to classify trees and have a correlation between the leaf area index to the species of the trees. So for specifically this case study, we are interested in actually the above ground mass of the tree. So we have to, so what we did was we reconstructed the branch of the trees and skeletonized the whole branch structure. And using a tube piping model, we were able to reconstruct the tree volume. And as you can see from the varying resolutions, you can actually even separate the different branching order. So the branching order 0 would be the trunk, and the secondary branch, and the, and further on where you have different branching order, and we can study the different architecture of the tree, and also at the same time obtain the above ground mass of the tree. Or you can also have a more realistic representation where you use surface to for visualization, to have a more realistic visualization of the area and of the landscape. And you can also have different convex hulls to roughly understand the volume it's occupying. So this whole process can be quite useful for many different disciplines. And the result was with this algorithm and with this workflow setup, we went around a neighborhood in Singapore and scanned 66 different trees where it was sampled, in terms of size, in terms of species, to kind of have a good sampling of the trees in the neighborhood. And out of the 66 trees, it worked for the algorithm worked for all 65 trees, except this tree. Essentially because in the tropics, trees are really lush. So trees like this essentially is covered with leaves, and it's impossible to segment the leaves from the branches. And as that's the case, the algorithms couldn't work on reconstructing the trees at all, because it's just a huge lump of point clouds. So there's always of course, there's a limitation to this workflow. But other than that, we were able to have algorithms to calculate the various attributes of a tree, biophysical attributes of the tree, such as a leaf area index, as compared to the traditional way of using a leaf area index meter and using a hemispherical camera. So the use of terrestrial LiDAR scan derived leaf area index has been seen as a more accurate way of getting the leaf area index of a tree. We also have the TRS derived above ground biomass, and as compared to the more common elementary equation that's used by most forestry and urban climatologists to kind of estimate above bioground mass of a tree. So with the data that we collected actually with my colleagues, we were able to set up a much more high accuracy allometric model, specifically for tropical urban trees, because the growth of tropical urban trees is different compared to most of the elementary equation that's used by in forestry discipline, because in urban landscape, essentially all the trees are pruned and there's limitation to their growth because there's buildings, obstructions and stuff. So the derived elementary equation was much more better in terms of estimating tree volume in urban setting. And interestingly, with the improved in estimation of the above ground mass, my colleague was able to have a better carbon accounting model, where he was able to have a more interesting finding that a lot of times the planting of trees in urban areas has been seen as trees are seen as a carbon sink, in a urban area. But from the carbon accounting model, it showed that trees are not carbon sink, in a tropical urban setting, because the microorganism required to support the tree in the soil, and also the pruning of the trees in a city make trees actually a carbon emitter. So there's actually the trees do not store as much carbon as we think it does. And of course, I'm not discouraging people from planting trees, but rather we have to plant trees for the right reason. And from this model, we can see that trees provide other good points, such as aesthetically making an environment more pleasing and having sun shading. But if you're planting trees to be used as a carbon sink, maybe you should rethink about that. So this is kind of the first project, where with the injection of algorithms and streamlined workflow, we were able to have a very interesting process and have new findings on the study of urban area. So for the second project, which is done when I was in Allinger Center with Forrest and many others colleagues, is the CoTube project. So in this project, it's a different models and algorithms and computation are used in a different way, where it helps to translate the result of a physical prototype into the design process. So let me illustrate that with this project. So I mean, just a quick background. The three primary heat transfer in heat transfer mechanism: conduction, convection, and radiation, and its relationship with a building, with the building envelope. I'm sorry. So I think there was I accidentally jump out of the screen share. So the heat mechanism with the building envelope. So you can see from this quadrant, we have on the y-axis is the permeability of the envelope. So airtight envelope and a permeable envelope. And on the x-axis is convection-based cooling and radiation-based cooling. So in building application of buildings, most of the time the most common way of cooling is essentially high energy air conditioning, where you have, so essentially most of the offices have like airtight envelope, and then you cool down the air, and then the air cool down the occupant, and so that's kind of the conventional practice. But there's also kind of gaining traction where we actually look at radiant-based cooling, where we have cooling panels, using radiation from cooled surface to cool down the occupant. And because radiation essentially is more radiant-based cooling, essentially a more high efficient cooling, and it's lower energy. Of course, in C, the highest energy is essentially you have a permeable envelope, but you still use convection-based cooling to cool down the space. So essentially, this is a picture I've taken back when I was in Singapore, where they have this outdoor cooling unit where they are throwing cooler air into open environment to try to cool down in like a few degrees of the space to make the space more thermally comfortable, which essentially would essentially would cause much higher energy. And then lastly, the lowest energy would essentially be be able to do radiant cooling on the occupants while allowing natural ventilation to provide some form of convection cooling at the same time. And that would essentially be the most targeted way to cool a person and create thermal comfort, but at the same time, the lowest energy. But essentially, the main issue with this in a hot and humid climate is that the ambient humid air would cause condensation to happen on the radiant surface, which is of much cooler temperature and below the dew point temperature. And so in the cold tube project, this is what we are interested in testing out. So can we do that? And that's why we built a 1:1 prototype back in Singapore, where we have hot and humid climate to actually do radiant cooling outdoor. So from what we know, that this is kind of one of the first environment that's engineered in the world. So I can give you a brief description of how do we achieve that without having condensation on our tube surface. So essentially, we call this the membrane assisted radiant cooling panel, where you can see that there is a thermal transparent membrane that still allows the occupant to radiatively be cooled by the tube surface, shown in the tube water pipes. But this physical separation would separate the ambient air from the tube surface, so that there's no condensation on the tube surface, while at the same time can still afford to cool down a person radiatively. So this is totally a different cooling paradigm, where in a building, usually we try to cool the space instead of the occupant. And for this use of radiative cooling to be more targeted at occupants, we're targeted at cooling down the occupants instead of the space. So that's like a whole different way of cooling. And I mean, we built the pavilion to kind of test out the effectiveness and whether it works well, because such it's kind of unheard of to just cool fully without cooling down the air at the same time. So just to give like a summary of how the algorithms are injected in, essentially is we kind of streamline the workflow between sensing and the visualization, and essentially translating that data to a model to evaluate how this can be fed back into the architectural design process. So the code tip was built, and different measurements were set up, and through the project we also find out some because the environment that was created by these radiant panels are so novel. There's certain measurements apparatus that is used conventionally to measure a conditioned space. It can't be used in this environment because of the huge separation between radiant temperature and the air temperature. Of course, the collection of data, how to visualize it. The video is showing how the panels is cooling down as we switch on the system. So that kind of helps us understand the performance of our pavilion, how we can improve on it. So one of the results that's shown here is we try to measure the radiative heat flux that is coming from the radiant cooling panels. So you can see that in this setup, the participant is standing right in front of the panels, and we have a heat flux sensor on the wrist. We were able to record, a certain heat loss from the body, so the amount of cooling that's coming from the radiant panels, and we were able to so we measured the heat flux, and as we reduce the chilled water temperature going through, as you can see from here, from 26.1 degrees Celsius to 16.3 degrees Celsius, the heat flux increased. So, and there's probably two main primary mechanisms here that it's cooling down the wrist area, but essentially looking at the air temperature, which is all about similar, the increase in the water temperature and the increase in the heat flux is essentially showing that we can control radiative cooling and convection independently. So in conventional cooling system, usually when you cool down a surface, the surface inevitably would convectively cool down the air too. But with the separation, we were able to independently control these two mechanisms to have a more targeted way of cooling the occupants. So as you can see, as we reduce the water temperature, the heat flux increases and the air temperature stays almost the same. So this kind of experiments is just trying to show we can, for the first time, we can control this mechanism in the interior space independently. And we also conducted a thermal comfort study. So that is more of a physiological measurement of considering whether this system can actually just purely radiatively, primarily radiate through radiant cooling, create a comfortable environment for the occupants. So we did thermal comfort studies where we surveyed people who went into the cold tube. Do they feel cooler or do they not? So from initial studies, we have found that the cold tube actually was able to provide a thermally comfortable environment for our occupants, for our participants. So with this, we are quite happy. We're really glad that this is a new way of cooling, new method of cooling, and how can this be applied in design, and how does this change the way we design cooling or HVAC system in a building. So this is a diagram that to illustrate that translation of data from the physical prototype into kind of a model or framework to think about cooling in hot and humid climate. So in A, you can see this is the conventional cooling where air conditioning is used, where we cool down the air in interior, and then we create a kind of thermally comfortable environment for the occupant. So we can see all the loads involved. And in B is if this cold tube panels was adapted into an interior space, and how that would, what that means, and what are the difference in loads that would be. So essentially, because our cold tube panels allows cooling, and it actually is able to create thermal comfort to the occupants without the need for a sealed envelope. So that kind of reduce a lot of redundant cooling that happens in conventional cooling system. So instead, cooling loads such as heat gain from envelope and the need to ventilate a sealed envelope is redundant now with our system. So since we are having a naturally ventilated space, but at the same time, we use radiant cooling to provide as the primary way to condition or to provide thermal comfort to an occupant. We kind of have the best of both worlds, from a natural ventilated space and air conditioned space. So some of the problem with natural ventilation is usually there's a compromise in terms of thermal comfort, where natural ventilation is always have varying effectiveness depending on where you are and depending on whether there's wind speed. But with the radiant panel, we can have an open envelope, but at the same time create conditions that is on the same level as a conditioned space, without the need to seal off the envelope. So that kind of has a repercussion to the whole building design field, that air conditioning doesn't mean a sealed airtight envelope. So these findings is translated into design implications, and we will apply it to a case study where, let's say, back in Singapore, public schools are usually naturally ventilated with a ceiling fan. So if we want to create a more thermally comfortable space for students, what do we need to do? So this is, so in A, that's kind of the base case of what's existing naturally ventilated classroom. And B is if the cold tube setup was adapted to a building, an interior building. So the main design implication is you have to kind of rearrange the ceiling space to make sure that there's enough surfaces to remove the to cool down the occupant. This in comparison to C and D, which C is kind of the most common way of conditioning a space with an air conditioning system, where you kind of have to have a closed envelope, while D is where you have a centralized system, where you have to, so in C, when you're using a decentralized split unit, essentially there's no fresh air intake, which essentially would cause a deterioration in indoor air quality for the students. But if you want fresh air intake with a better indoor air quality, you might need a centralized system where you bring in fresh air intake, but that essentially have certain implication in terms of ducting spaces. Yeah, so from the physical prototype, from the data that we got, we were able to translate it to a simple kind of a thermal model and use it in the design process and kind of figure out what are the implications spatially and at the same time energetically. So with this, we kind of have an idea of where our system is in comparison to existing system, and from here, future investigation would try to improve our systems in comparison to these conventional systems. So this is kind of the second project, and for the third project, where it's more about the communications of data, of different data from different disciplines in a design team. So the idea is to use 3D modeling techniques and visualization to help researchers quickly see relationship between data of different disciplines. So for example, in these two examples, we are seeing 2 dimensions data of, so the color means one attribute, and the extrusion is another attribute. So for example, on the left hand side, this is showing essentially the first color diagram is showing the distance between from this the distance to a nearby subway station, and the extrusion kind of shows the existing real estate price. So you can kind of overlap different data onto each other, and kind of try to find research gaps between different fields for investigation. So the context of this project is looking at the Campus as a Lab program in Princeton. So essentially, the Campus as a Lab program encourages researchers in Princeton to conduct their research in campus using the Campus as a Lab. So campus funds a lot of different projects, and each project, when done, a report is submitted, and it's submitted to the to Campus as a Lab. Yeah, but the data and how all this data is accessible, it's unclear. So currently, there's no a central infrastructure to make data more accessible to the campus as a whole, although the Campus as a Lab is funding all these projects. So it will be really a nice system to set up to make data more accessible and be able to visualize and overlay data from different projects onto each other, and to see if there is a gap or maybe there is not. So the fact that we need that infrastructure to make it more accessible to people. So our lab has a project from Campus as a Lab, and we are looking at, for example, at powering all the golf carts in the campus using PV panels. So essentially that would require a few, we need to actually visualize and analyze a few, 2 main sets of data. So on the environmental side, we actually need to visualize the data of the solar irradiation, that's in the campus, and also at the same time the movement data of the golf cart. So, but currently, we do not have a way or do not have a central infrastructure to do that. So, what this project is about is to create a central database and to be able to visualize different sets of data and overlay them together. So how I go about doing this is essentially we have to first build a model of Princeton University. So you can request you can request a 3D data from Princeton campus, but essentially there's it's not open, so it's not openly shared. You can't openly share the data. So the approach we took is we gathered all openly available data, and using different sources, we consolidate them and build a 3D model as shown in this GIF, where we were able to estimate the tree heights. We were able to get the building heights and the building volume. We have the terrain information, and with that, we can run a solar simulation to figure out roughly the different solar irradiation throughout the campus. So we can overlay the solar with the movement data to find out as the golf cart park, where would the optimal parking area for a golf cart when it's not moving, so that it can have maximize its it can recharge its battery as much as possible. So I set up. First of all, I set up the 3D model, and followed by this 3D model is distributed. So can be distributed through a simple app, where you can download the app, you can download the data, you can explore the data, you can switch on and off different different sets of data. You can have an animation of understanding how the movement and the solar data coincides. You can figure out where would be the best place to park your golf cart, and so as to make sure that you can power your golf cart with solar power. So this is just kind of a very pilot study to try to be able to figure out how do I sort this data, how do I distribute them, how do I have access, and how can someone explore this central database. So that is kind of the end of the third project. And the last project is essentially coming back to design, where I was able to, looking at the few previous projects where it's mainly about research, it's mainly about prototyping, but how does all this come back to design, and how do you make use of different algorithms in the design process to generate better designs? So this project is a project that I done back when I was in Singapore, and it was a 2-week workshop where we were able to actually let students quickly to be able to enable students to use all these algorithms in their design. So they are like year 1 or year 2 architectural design students who usually have difficulty, implementing all these algorithms in their design process. So as you can see from the diagram, the biggest break has always been from 3D modeling, and how do you connect to parametric modeling and generating many different designs, and how do you run optimization algorithms, and how do you actually evaluate your design in terms of environmental objectives. So what we did here was it was a 3-stage design process. We slowly introduced algorithms into the design process, so that the students know what the algorithms is doing. So they're not just mindlessly or aimlessly clicking software or learning softwares, but rather as algorithms are introduced, they kind of understand what's happening. So the first stage is essentially, we have a design brief. We have they would think about a design formulation, what the design. They will model their design, and then they will generate different designs. And in the first stage, they will evaluate their design, and essentially they would repeat. So it's an iterative cycle. So the first stage is essentially the only automated or algorithmically injected task is the evaluation task here. And in the second stage, we introduce parametric modeling to them, so they can generate much more designs here. And in the third stage, an optimization algorithm, which can fully automate search for good designs, is introduced, and they can so that they can use the optimization algorithm and generate the designs in their design process. So I'll walk through the different stages, and essentially all the tasks are automated, and this leave the designer's main task in reflecting and thinking about what would be the best design, instead of figuring out how to model or how to set up the process. So in the first stage, concept exploration, evaluation is the task that was automated, and evaluation was automated. So essentially, running a solar simulation on the building to figure out, is this the optimal solar irradiation received for a certain building form, and at the same time calculating the build area of a building. So you want to both maximize the floor area, but at the same time you want your building to have good to reduce the solar irradiation, to have optimal solar irradiation on your facade of your building. So this was the interface set up for the students, where they would model their building in a 3D model software that usually used in architecture to model, let's say, 2 to 3 different models. They will just put it in to a script that I have written for them, where they just have to specify, where the files are, and they will be able to receive feedback on the performance. So students can quickly see how their designs are affecting the performance in this case. So that's the first stage. So in the second stage, we introduce a parametric modeling, where the students are able to quickly change the building form of their design, where they can twist it, and they can just have to specify a parameter of changing the height, and of changing the height of and twisting some kind of morphological operators to parameterize the building. So the students just have to specify a meshing model file, and they can specify what twisting they would want and slanting they would want, and they will be able to generate different design variants, and of course their performance at the same time. So they can quickly vary their design and receive feedback on their yeah. So feedback on their design. And lastly, we automated the optimization algorithm, where you can just specify different ranges of the morphological operators, and the computers will automatically match up the parameters and generate like hundreds of designs for the students. And so it was quite successful. Out of the 28 students in the workshop, we were able to generate most of the 28 students, 27 students, was able to complete the exercise, and close to 5,000 different designs were generated by 27 students. Was generated. So you can see like the various designs that's generated, and from this graph you can see that as more designs are explored, you can actually find better performing designs. So like by automating the search for designs, we were able to you know, help students find better design options. So I mean, so that's kind of the 4 projects that kind of give an overview of my research. And moving forward from here, so all these projects were made possible by this library that I developed throughout my research years, and they are used to set up all this workflow and all this and develop these algorithms. So moving forward, I would really like to keep on working on such a library to help rapid prototype various different workflows for either research or design, and at the same time integrate it into a global information systems where you have data models and algorithms to kind of essentially as much as possible streamline workflows and develop algorithms to better help such a process. And that kind of is the end of my presentation. Thank you.
Great, thanks, Kian Wee. Let's jump into some of the questions we've been getting. We're going to try and finish up by around 3:10, so we'll take about 10 minutes for questions. And there's a few I'm going to group together here just on this last idea of visualization and from your LIDAR project. So maybe you could comment on a few more details on the carbon accounting you mentioned in the LIDAR, as well as the meshing method you used to construct tree crowns. And then finally, maybe are those all related to the visualizations that you showed in the data visualization project 3? Sort of how are you getting these 3-dimensional forms? And then, yeah, the first point being, how did you do the tree carbon accounting related to that?
So for the carbon accounting models, I'm not the expert in that. So essentially this project was, I think why this project was so interesting to me is that I brought in my expertise in terms of geometry handling and the ability to process all this geometry, while the urban climatologist here, Eric Velasco, back in Sensum, he brought in his expertise in carbon accounting. So I'm only familiar with what he needed from me. So what he needed from me is essentially a more high resolution and precise volume of the tree, which he couldn't get without the terrestrial LiDAR scan. So with the higher precision modeling, he was able to better balance his model. And actually there was a paper written about this where maybe we can share it after this presentation, and if the details are in there. And for the meshing side, so for handling the trees, it essentially what I did was I did not actually develop novel algorithms or anything to deal with the trees. Is essentially I implemented existing algorithms. And what I think the main contribution from my side is essentially coordinating or interfacing all these algorithms together and these softwares together so it's essentially constructing these pipelines. So for the meshing side, what we used was I can't remember it exactly. So it's based on a paper that skeletonized that essentially, if you can manually segment the tree, the individual tree out, based on the points, it can skeletonize. The structure of the tree. through nodes and edges. So from that nodes and edges, we then use a piping model to figure out, based on the point clouds around the edge, you can figure out the diameter of the branches or the trunk. So those are existing algorithms that I just coordinated and put together and in a pipeline for this specific project. So I mean, for people who are interested, I can actually send out related papers and they can actually look at how to do that. And I guess for the visualization, those are usually based on data that's openly available. So I think that's I think for architecture, or even for a lot of built environment researchers, like we actually do have a lot of open data around on the web. It's just that how do we sort that out and be able to visualize them together? So that's kind of the, I think that's kind of the issue and problem that we have to resolve here and streamline the pipeline.
Great, thanks. Related to the cold tube, your co-author Eric Teitelbaum and I, myself, are both curious how you might characterize some of the challenges to the adoption of a system like that. Maybe you can give your view of where that might go practically and what are the challenges. And then sort of related to that, another question that might be answered would be, how exactly do we evaluate these quote unquote performance outcomes of different designs more broadly? Do these performance metrics that we use take into account interactions between different parameters, or are they assuming simpler linear summations of all the different pieces? So I guess first, challenges more generally to things like the cold tube, and then more broadly, when you use parameters, are they simplified, or what are the interrelationships between this multi-parametric design you discussed?
I guess for the first question, I think the main challenge here is that, especially it's very timely for the COVID situation here, where we are talking about whether a sealed envelope and air conditioning, whether it's it's a good environment in terms of dealing with viruses and the ventilation rate. So I mean, for cold tube, the main challenge is, I think, is essentially the implication on the envelope side. So although we can with the cold tube, we do not need airtight envelope, air sealed envelope, but essentially we still have the issue dealing with other parameters such as noise and air pollution. So and that is a much difficult issue to address than the thermal issue. So if your building is facing a road, a major highway, or if you're in a developing country where you have issue dealing with air pollutions, it's just not possible to open your windows. So even if you're able to do it, with a thermal system that can do it, it's still gonna be hard to convince anyone to use that. So I think in order to kind of push for cold tube, I mean, essentially in the COVID-19 situation, that might play out to be a good factor for us to push for it, because better air changes would help and maybe reduce the spread of the viruses. But we have to look at the bigger picture in terms of the context, in terms of air and noise pollution, and we figure out, if we open up the windows, what else are we bringing in, other than air changes. So for the second question on the different parameters and different performance, I think that's that's really a very messy, difficult to answer question. So like, me working on this field has been dealing with how do you measure the value of a design, So some people would look at it and think that, the environmental parameters objectives are much more important. And you have architects come in design, architectural building designs it's hard to measure the value of the aesthetic of the building, and comes like it's hard to come to a consensus. But essentially, the way I see this is, I guess it has to come. We have to have essentially a bottom line. That's how I see it. So like a building should be able to at least satisfy a set of performance. So essentially, and that baseline for performance should be set with everyone. So essentially, the built environment doesn't just concern, let's say, architects or engineers. It concerns everyone. So how do we set this performance baseline? Is something that we have to come together and decide as a whole. As I think as a society, or as a to how to do that. So I think as a start, maybe I would suggest that essentially university campus is a good starting point, where it's kind of like a mini city, but yet it's run by a kind of a less complicated, messy entity. So it's run by a kind of more streamlined entity where you can set that baseline, and that kind of reflects the value of the campus, and that should guide every development within the campus. And I think that would help sort out the different parameters between design and how do you measure the value of the design. So I think that would be the way forward for me. Yeah.
No, I think it's a real challenge to address the areas of optimization and parameterization that you deal with, where you have weighting factors. Sometimes you have to weight things in design that aren't analytically quantified as they are in energy performance that we may analyze. So I think you're right to consider that. And I guess lastly, as we exit and think about moving forward in campus, maybe you can provide people some ideas for how the geometry, like the radiant analysis that we do spatially, that you showed with, like, even for the golf cart with the sun, but also for the cold tube, where we can radiantly make things feel cold. As we wrap up, maybe you can give us a picture of how that might help us spend more time outside, particularly if the semester ends before Thanksgiving. Do you think that we could have more thermal comfort outside with better spatial data? I guess that's do you feel like there's the geometric power to design things that could really change the paradigm of whether we should be inside all the time or outside?
Well,
after experiencing the cold tube or doing your modeling?
Well, but I still think that, the environment should be, I don't know. So like for example, the cold tube, when we first envisioned the cold tube, it was supposed to be outside, right? So it's like outdoor cooling, I guess. But I guess it's just too energy intensive to be kind of cooling the outdoors, right? And the fact that we want to go to the outdoor is that, we want something different from the indoors, I guess. So if we are going to condition the outdoors like the indoors, so I think that's going to be intensive task, and I'm not sure how would you be able to do that. But you can, I guess, you can have, instead of just having an indoor and outdoor with the cold tube with radiant cooling, we can have this in-between space where it's mediated, but it's still kind of outdoor. It's kind of like an intervention throughout the environment.
So look forward to the fall. Everybody being hanging out in the Anlinger Center courtyards safely outside. That was what I'm leading to. But yeah, we should thank you again. Thank everybody for helping organize. I think Charlie has a few announcements for the next webinar coming up. If I'm not mistaken.
I do. Can you all hear me?
Yes. Thanks.
So, thank you, Forrest, and thank you, Kian Wee, again for that interesting presentation. I also want to acknowledge the Anlinger Center staff who are working hard behind the scenes to to support the creation and delivery of this webinar series.
Mhm.
So in closing, thank you all for attending today. The next webinar in our series will be at 2 p.m. on Wednesday, July 1st. In the chat box, I've posted a link to the webpage, which lists the whole webinar series where you can register to attend future talks. Next week, Dr. Tapa Padacharjee will present his research on bacterial motility in porous confined spaces and how the results help inform and improve environmental bioremediation strategies. I look forward to seeing you at future talks. And in the meantime, everyone stay safe and healthy. Thanks again.
Great. Thanks everybody for attending. Thanks, Kian Wee, again. Have a great
Thanks,
afternoon.
everybody.